Hello again. I'm Daniel Thompson, owner, founder, and editor-in-chief of the Uptown Observer. This means nothing to you guys, but right now I have my cat on my lap and I'm petting her like I am a villain in an old Bond film. Today, our subject will be journalism. Quite honestly, the question that I'm probably asked most throughout the past 6 months, 9 months has been, how did you get into journalism? And to be quite honest, I don't know exactly the response that people are looking for when they ask me that. Um, Maybe they think that I have a long history of being in the industry or that my family was, but that's not so much the case. Um, in fact, my first exposure to journalism as an industry was through Superman, Clark Kent, because when I was a kid, I used to almost religiously watch the old, not Superman the animated series or that 90s cartoon, but I was watching like the old like serials, like Superman versus like the Robot Men and stuff like that, like even like pre George Reeves Superman. So he really didn't report on anything back then. Like, for those that don't know, so back when they decided Clark Kent would be a reporter or a journalist, like they didn't even think about what that meant. If Clark Kent was a real journalist, he would be fired within like a week. He's never in the office. Never. Like he's just distracted. He's just distracted. He'll be in the middle of a conversation with like Perry White and he's like, "Oh, I got to go." It's like, what is going on? Nowadays, there would be a serious conversation and probably a drug test if Clark Kent worked in like any office in the local region. Anyway, so that was my first exposure to quote unquote journalism. And I put quotes around it because, again, there wasn't really much value in what I was presented. It was just kind of a background. They had to choose some job, and journalist was it. Um, and I wouldn't really encounter, I mean, my father wrote columns for the Journal Times in Racine. So I had some exposure to newspapers that way. And in about high school, I started writing for high school newspapers, but nothing of much substance, you know. It wasn't until my junior year in college that I became an intern at Beloit Daily News under editor in chief Bill Barth. And I worked with their features editor of the time, who retired, I believe, a couple years after. Um, And I wrote my first story about the Welty Environmental Center, I believe, in Beloit. And it was just a story about kids exploring the environment, just nature, and particular, I believe it was a turtle called Dinner Plate because it was the size of a dinner plate. Um, and I think for the first time, I had I crossed over from thinking, so I was an English major, so creative writing was kind of where I was headed or thought I was headed. So you have to fill in a lot of color of characters when you're trying to write creatively. And I thought that was the way to go because I didn't find people very interesting at that time in my life because I just hadn't maybe been exposed to enough people or enough people of different thought. Um, but then I started to be able to kind of see throughout working with Beloit Daily News and doing a couple features that people are interesting and everybody has story and there's interest and there's value in the wonder that we all feel when discovering things. I mean, we should cover and be able to highlight wonder as much as we do fear or anger, which I talked about in the previous episode, so I won't dive into here. which, if you haven't listened to it, go back to episode 1 entitled Fear and hear me talk about my thoughts on that. But again, it was the very beginning. And so I graduate from Madison, and I realized that my English degree wasn't going to do anything for me. So I rested on my internship and got a job in Western Nebraska at the Western Nebraska Observer, which is where the Uptown Observer gets the Observer part of its name, actually. Because it was my first paper. It was my first full-time job as a journalist. I was there as a reporter for about for about maybe a year, and then I became the editor and publisher for my second year after having 2 bosses. I think it's just because I was there. But it was my first exposure to being a reporter or a journalist in a small town, which is different than a big city. Being a journalist in a big city, yeah, people may get mad at you, but they're anonymous. Being a journalist in a small town means that everybody who's mad at you, you know, and they know where you are. And they're going to tell you that they're mad at you. So I got to kind of go through trial by fire. The first 2 were some years of my career. I made a lot of mistakes. And the thing is, looking back now, they were the mistakes of a young man with quite a bit of ego and confidence he hadn't earned. And I think that's still why I make some of the mistakes that I do. But it was very much, I always thought that I was right, and I never wanted to be wrong. So much so that when I became the editor and publisher, I had committed myself to try to never print a correction. Not that I would just refuse, but that I was going to get everything right. It wasn't long that I had to print a correction, and that was humbling. And then you realize that every newspaper does, because nobody gets it right all the time. That was also the place that I realized what happens when you chase your own interest or intrigue or your own thoughts on something instead of how the community needs you to present it. Um, this was a suicide of a businessman that happened in Kimmel, Nebraska, which is the city that I was working in at the time. And me, being me, who is, I would say, desensitized to things because I've been watching horror movies, and I was researching the Black Dahlia case when I was like 17. So I've seen some stuff at this point. It didn't faze me. The idea of the horror of the scene of a suicide. But I was warned by multiple people, don't present it a certain way. And again, I'm young and I'm overconfident and I think they're all stupid and I'm smart, so I did. First time I got endless phone calls about how tacky I am and how immoral and unethical, and go on and on and on and on and on. And it was well deserved, because no, I shouldn't have done it how I did. And I'd probably be one of the people calling and yelling at myself today if older me could go back and exist there at that time. And that was the beginning of what I would call the period of breaking in, realizing how little I know, actually. And so that breaking in period lasted through my stay in Kimball, which lasted 2 to 3 years. And then I went on to Monticello, Indiana, where I was city editor and then managing editor. And I wrote a story that I think about still to this day as the worst thing I ever did in journalism. And it was about a pastor that that had sexually assaulted a child over a number of years, over basically the kid's formative years. Um, in fact, it was two kids. And why I react so calm to things now, or I try very hard to not react passionately, is because of how I reacted then. Because you see, I had personal experience with things like that because somebody I grew up with that went on to be a pastor just maybe around the same time as this. No, it was a few years before. But within, I'd say, 5 years' time, had been arrested and convicted of um, molesting and fooling around with kids in their congregation. And again, I grew up with this person. So I think the mixture of my bitterness and resentment towards that person and the arrest affidavit and details that I read in this other pastor's case, I lost it and I lost perspective and I lost balance and I went scorched earth on this person. And some of you may think, all right, well, they're a pedophile. He was convicted, by the way. But the thing when you go scorched earth is that you're not thinking about the things that are burning along the way. You want it all bare. So I didn't notice or didn't think about the fact that I had pretty much pointed an arrow right to who all the victims were. I didn't think about how reliving details of that story would hurt them. I didn't think about all the things people shouldn't see. So I failed miserably and completely. And there were people who, I had a publisher who was just, dear God, this man had read the story, all of it, and approved it. And then afterwards, he praised me for it. Yeah, I hate that story. I really do. But anyway, eventually I made my way to Kenosha and I was back home. And that was the whole point. The whole point was to be gone long enough to get experience to come back and work for Kenosha News. And I did. Got hired by Mike Larson. And I got to work in the little cubicle with Dave Walter, John Sloka, and Kevin Boyer. Kevin. And Susie, of course, later on, who was Mike's administrative assistant and really was the brains of the operation during that time. And it was wonderful. I had a wonderful staff. I finally had made it to a point where I had enough staff. I had between 9 and 12 people at my disposal after only having myself and one other person for 5 years. I had a boss I actually liked, and I felt like I had finally made it. Lasted for 6 months. Within that point, the company walked Mike Larson out the door without explanation, ushered the other editors into a room where the publisher of the time, Randy Rickman, was, and another man we didn't know turned out to be Mike's interim replacement, even though The company never intended to hire that man and instead was already talking to Bob Heiss, who would be Mike's permanent replacement, and told us that not only was Mike gone, that they had eliminated his position, but also we were going to lose 6 staff members. That was the beginning of the end. So we lost 6, and then a few months later, we lost a few more, and then got bought by Lee Enterprises, and then we lost more, and down to skeleton crew. And then, of course, came the, oh, by the way, I hate this term. I really do. Civil unrest. Civil unrest. It makes it sound so pleasant. How do you boil down something that's supposed to make a point, that's supposed to upset you, supposed to be kind of a bitter taste, to something so pleasing sounding? Oh, we don't have riots. We don't have people screaming for justice. We don't have black people getting beaten in the streets and then responding in kind. No, we just have civil unrest. Yeah, that's what you got. Keep calling it civil unrest, and you're going to keep having a lot of civil unrest. Anyway, you all probably know the story of my separation from Kenosha News. And the thing is, looking back now, I'm not really as bitter about it. It was going to happen eventually. My criticisms still stand that I levied at that time, and they'll probably always stand. Corporations don't ever really pay attention to a little guy. They won't even mention my name. In fact, Kenosha News will all but erase me from that point in history. Because guess what, guys? Kenosha News is the paper of record. So years and years from now, saying that these articles and archives of newspapers don't last or aren't kept, or companies decide they're not worth paying to house, will go away. All that's going to be left of what I did and of what happened here is the record of Kenosha News, the record that doesn't mention me. I've known that all along. So it's an interesting thing to be a journalist now, an independent journalist. Because while I have all the experience I do, and I'm an award-winning photographer and writer, I have 7 to 10 awards. I will always be on the outside in my hometown because I'm not the person running the game. And that's okay. I realized through everything I went through that the point isn't to be remembered in the annals of history. It's to be remembered by the people that were around you. It's to do something, whether it be through journalism, volunteerism, or activism, or anything. The true reward of life is to be remembered by the people that encountered you, not people that got to hear some pretty words about you while being far and far away. Your reward is being able to help your neighbors, be able to love your neighbors, and them being able to do the same to you in kind. And now that's how I view journalism. So I'm broke. I don't own a thing in this world of material, but I consider myself more of a journalist now than I ever did when I was making 50,000 and didn't have a worry in the world. That's my reward.